The paper plate sat at the far edge of the table, a plastic fork balanced on its rim, a small crumble of pumpkin pie clinging to the curve. Laughter rose and fell around me, the scent of turkey and cinnamon filling the air, yet not one chair was pulled out for me. I'd been handed my plate in the kitchen, told there was no more room. I sat alone listening. Sometimes the empty space they give you speaks louder than any words. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. The first snow of the season had begun to fall that week, soft and powdery, the kind that clung to the edges of windows like lace. I've always liked the quiet of early winter here in our little town in Iowa. The streets slow down, the air smells faintly of chimney smoke, and everything feels wrapped in a kind of hush. For most of my life, this house has been my anchor through those seasons. A steady presence, no matter how the years turned. It's not a grand house, not by anyone's measure. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen just big enough to turn around in. My late husband, Harold, built most of it with his own hands back in 1968. I remember standing beside him in the yard as the frame went up, the smell of cut wood mixing with the scent of my coffee. We were younger then, with calloused hands and tired backs, but it felt like we were building more than walls. We were building a life. Harold's laugh used to fill this place. It was the kind of laugh that started deep in his chest and rolled outward, catching everyone around him. I still hear it sometimes, in the creak of the floorboards, in the clink of dishes in the sink, in the warm hum of the furnace at night. He's been gone 11 years now, but the house still feels like him in small, unexplainable ways. After he passed, it was just me and the house. My days became quieter, my steps slower. My income came from Social Security and Harold's modest pension from the factory. It was enough to keep the lights on, pay the taxes, and buy a few small comforts. I learned to stretch things the way women of my generation always have. A soup pot could last 3 days. A sweater could be mended for another winter. And love, well, I thought love, especially from family, could be trusted to last too. I have 2 children, Michael, my eldest, and Claire, my youngest. They both grew up under this roof, tracking snow through the hallway in their boots, slamming the screen door behind them on warm summer nights. Michael was the quieter one, thoughtful, always with a book in his hand. Claire had a brightness to her, always talking, always in motion. They each married and built lives of their own. Michael just 15 miles away in Cedar Falls, Claire 2 towns over. 4 years after Harold's death, the house was still full on holidays. Thanksgiving especially. The table stretched to fit everyone, grandchildren weaving between chairs, the smell of my pies drawing them into the kitchen. I made sure there was always a place for each of them. Even as my joints stiffened and the stairs became harder to climb, I never thought of those gatherings as a burden. Family was family. But this past year something shifted. The visits grew shorter. Calls became fewer. There were quiet exchanges between Michael and Claire that stopped when I entered the room. Conversations about what's best for me, as if I weren't standing right there. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe they were just busy. People have lives after all. Still, there were little signs. I'd be told about family events after they happened. Oh, we thought you knew. When we did meet, they'd glance at one another when bills were mentioned, as though the weight of my expenses were theirs to carry. Once, when the furnace broke in January, I asked Michael for advice about repairmen. He sighed long and heavy before giving me a number to call. It wasn't what he said, it was the pause before he said it. The house, my safe place, began to feel like a point of contention. Comments about downsizing slipped into conversation like stray threads. Easy to overlook until you realized how many had been woven in. I'd catch Michael eyeing the steps with concern, Claire noting how much space I must be heating for just one person. They said these things with a kind of politeness that made it hard to respond without seeming ungrateful. I didn't understand it fully then, but I do now. Sometimes love doesn't disappear all at once. It thins out over time like an old quilt. You can still see the pattern, still remember its warmth, but the fabric has worn too much to keep out the cold. There were moments in those months when I'd wander the house in the evening, my hand brushing along the wood banister Harold had carved. I'd pause at the kitchen window, looking out at the bare maple tree in the yard, and wonder what would become of this place when I was gone. I thought of the boxes in the attic, letters Harold had written me when we were courting, baby clothes from both children, the Afghan my mother made for our wedding. It's hard to explain, but those things feel like more than objects. They're the proof of a life built with care. I believed my children saw that too. I believed they would want to protect it. I believed they understood that this house isn't just a building. It's where our story is rooted. But that Thanksgiving morning when I walked into the dining room and saw the table crowded with smiling faces and not a single place set for me, I felt the first true crack. Not anger, not yet. Just the cold realization that somehow, without warning, I had been moved to the margins of my own family's life. And in that moment, with snow falling beyond the window and the hum of conversation carrying on without me, I began to understand. Love can fade quietly, but so can the place you hold in the world, if you let others decide where you belong. After that Thanksgiving, the air between us was different. It wasn't a sharp break, nothing loud or obvious, but rather a steady cooling, like a room where someone has turned down the heat without telling you. You only notice when you realize you've started shivering. December came and went. Michael called on Christmas morning, his voice brisk, distracted. He said they'd already opened presents at Claire's house and didn't want to make me drive in the snow. I reminded him the weather was clear that day, but he simply repeated that it was better this way. I ate dinner alone, reheating a small pot of chicken soup. I told myself it was just the busyness of the season. The truth was harder. I was being left out quietly, politely, the kind of exclusion that could almost pass for care if you didn't look too closely. January brought its own small stings. Claire stopped by one afternoon unannounced. She glanced around the living room, her eyes lingering on the stack of unopened mail by the phone. She asked if I'd been keeping up with my bills, her tone light but edged. I assured her I had. She nodded, though her gaze didn't soften. She noticed the snow on the front walk and suggested I hire a service before I slipped. I told her I'd been shoveling snow for 50 years. She smiled faintly, the way one smiles at a child who doesn't understand the conversation. At the grocery store, I bumped into a neighbor, Mrs. Hanley. She asked if I'd enjoyed the New Year's Eve gathering at Michael's. I told her I hadn't been there. Her eyebrows rose. Oh, I thought. Her voice trailed off. That was how I learned there had been a gathering at all. Each small omission was easy enough to explain away, but they began to gather like snow drifts, one piling quietly on top of the other. I started noticing the way Michael and Claire spoke about me, not to me but about me when they thought I wasn't listening. Words like manage and decide crept in. They spoke in the same tone one might use when discussing repairs to an old roof. Once I heard Michael ask Claire, "Do you think she even notices?" I didn't hear her reply. I didn't need to. They began talking more openly about downsizing. Not in a cruel way, they couched it in concern. "Think how much easier life would be for you," Claire would say, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "No yard work, no big property taxes." Michael would mention how many nicer senior apartments were opening in town. They never said outright that I should leave, but the message was there, woven into each conversation like an invisible thread. What made it worse was the absence of the simple warmth they once gave without thinking. No more stopping by just to share a cup of tea. No more phone calls to ask how my garden was coming along. They only called when something needed discussing, usually something about the house, my health, or my finances. One afternoon in early March, I came into the kitchen to find Michael flipping through my mail without asking. He said he was just making sure I wasn't missing anything important. I told him I was capable of reading my own letters. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you are, Mom. We just worry." I wish I could say I confronted them then, but I didn't. At that point, I still wanted to believe their distance was just a misunderstanding, something that could be softened with patience. So I swallowed the small indignities, folded them neatly, and stored them away like linens I might someday need. Spring came late that year, the ground slow to thaw. I busied myself with the little rituals of the season. Wiping down the porch rails, airing out the curtains, planting pansies in the flower boxes. The house felt lighter with the windows open, though that lightness didn't extend to my heart. When Michael visited in April, he stood on the porch instead of coming inside. He mentioned a brochure he'd picked up for a retirement community 2 towns over. He spoke about it the way one might speak about a vacation resort, walking paths, a small library, communal dining. I asked if he had already looked into the cost. He said not to worry about that. The word settled on me like a stone. Not to worry. as if my life were being drawn in a ledger somewhere I couldn't see. The silences grew heavier. I found myself eating dinners with the radio on just to fill the space. On Sundays, I drove myself to church, sitting in the same pew Harold and I had claimed for decades. People there still saw me, they asked about my garden, remembered my birthday. It was a comfort, but it also made the distance from my own children feel sharper. By early summer, I'd learned to expect the small humiliations. The whispered conversations in the hallway when they thought I was in another room. The way they exchanged glances when I reached for my checkbook. The casual mentions of your age, as though it explained everything. These weren't storms, they were slow leaks, the kind that weaken a house without a single crash. And in the quiet of my evenings, when the sun dipped low and the cicadas sang, I began to understand something I hadn't wanted to see. This wasn't about my safety or even my comfort. It was about control. About deciding for me before I could decide for myself. What they didn't know, what I didn't yet fully know myself, was that I wasn't ready to give that away. Not to them. Not to anyone. It was late November again, the kind of gray day where the light never fully arrives. The cold had settled into the ground, and the maple tree in the front yard stood bare, its branches reaching like thin hands toward the sky. Thanksgiving morning. I had risen early, as I always did, putting on the same soft cardigan Harold used to say made me look like home. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen. I'd baked a pumpkin pie the day before, even though I hadn't been asked to bring anything. I told myself it was habit. In truth, it was hope that maybe this year would feel like the old years. Michael had insisted we have dinner at his house. He said it would be easier for everyone. I asked if I could bring something. He said no, that everything was handled. I still made the pie. When I arrived, the house was already full. Laughter and the clink of silverware drifted from the dining room. Coats hung in the hallway, the smell of turkey and sage drifting through the air. I stepped inside, holding my pie, waiting for the warmth of welcome. No one looked up right away. Claire was at the table, pouring gravy into a bowl. Michael stood near the counter, carving meat. Their children darted through the space, carrying rolls and napkins. I waited for someone to tell me where to put the pie. Instead, Michael glanced over his shoulder and said, almost absently, "Just set it in the kitchen." His voice had the tone of someone asking for a glass of water, not speaking to their mother on Thanksgiving. I moved toward the table, but every chair was already taken, cousins, in-laws, neighbors. My place wasn't there. On the far counter near the sink, a single paper plate had been set down, a plastic fork resting on top, a napkin folded once. Michael didn't look at me when he said, "There's no room at the table, we've got extra folks this year. You can eat in the den if you want." The room carried on without pause, laughter, chatter, the scrape of forks. My hands felt suddenly heavy holding the pie. I went into the den, setting it on the coffee table. I sat down on the couch, my paper plate in my lap, listening to the life of the family carry on in the next room without me. The voices I had fed and cared for my entire life now moved around me like I was air. I thought I could hold it in, but as I lifted my fork, I heard Claire's voice drift in from the dining room. She was speaking to someone, maybe her husband, maybe Michael, I couldn't tell. Her tone was matter of fact, almost cheerful. She really should think about moving into a smaller place before she hurts herself. Stairs aren't safe at her age. Michael's reply came easily. "I know. I've been looking into some options. There are a few good nursing homes around here." There was the scrape of a chair, then a softer voice. Maybe Claire again, but I caught the words. "She's not really part of this family anymore. She's just here." I didn't move. My fork hovered over the pie, my hands suddenly still. I let their words sink in, each one settling like a stone inside me. It wasn't the first time I'd been left out, but this was different. This wasn't about convenience or a crowded table. This was about erasing me while I was still sitting in the next room. About deciding my worth without even looking me in the eye. I thought of Harold, how he used to pull out my chair first no matter where we were. How he'd say, "Your place is right here beside me." And now here I was in the house my son owned, holding a paper plate, as my children discussed where I should be put away. The den was quiet except for the faint clink of cutlery from the other room. My pie sat untouched. I looked around, the framed photos on the wall, the neat little stacks of magazines, the glow of the lamp in the corner. Everything looked warm and inviting, but I felt colder than I had in years. I realized then that there are two kinds of losses in life. The first comes with warning, an illness, a goodbye, a last conversation. The second is quieter, but it cuts deeper. It's when someone decides you are no longer necessary and doesn't bother to tell you. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up and leave. I simply sat there, fork in hand, and let the truth wrap around me. They had already decided I was no longer part of the story, at least not in the way that mattered to them. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I didn't know it yet, but this was the point where the sorrow began to make space for something else. Something colder, steadier. The kind of clarity that comes when you realize you've been quietly pushed out, and no one is going to open the door again. I ate my pie slowly, one bite at a time. Each forkful tasted faintly of cinnamon and ash. I didn't say a word that afternoon. When the meal ended, I helped clear the plates, even the ones I'd never eaten from. Rinsing dishes in the sink while voices floated in from the living room. I moved slowly, as if every motion needed to be deliberate. I think I was afraid that if I moved too quickly, something in me would crack and spill out onto the floor. When the last dish was stacked, I put on my coat and stepped outside. The air was sharp with winter, smelling faintly of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Snow crunched under my shoes as I walked to the car. I didn't linger, didn't wait for anyone to come say goodbye. Driving home, the streets were quiet. Porch lights glowed against the early dark. Families gathered inside their warm houses. My own porch light was a small, steady beacon in the distance. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the way it always had. Dark roof dusted with snow, the maple tree standing guard out front. I sat in the car a long while before going inside. I think I was waiting for the weight in my chest to ease, but it didn't. Instead, a different feeling began to grow there, not anger, not yet. Something else. Inside, I set my coat on the hook and stood in the hallway, listening to the familiar creaks of the floorboards. I touched the wall where Harold had once leaned a ladder to paint the trim. My hand lingered there. This house had been ours for nearly 50 years. Every corner carried our fingerprints, our laughter, our arguments, our reconciliations. And somewhere deep in its bones, it still held my place, even if my family no longer did. That was when the thought came. The deed. I hadn't looked at it in years, but I knew exactly where it was. In the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, wrapped in a manila envelope. It was still in my name. Solely in my name. Harold and I had made it that way when we refinanced after the kids were grown. The paper was cool in my hands when I pulled it out later that night. The ink had faded slightly, but the letters were still clear. My name alone. Seeing it there was like finding a hidden door I'd forgotten existed. A reminder that, in at least one corner of my life, I was still the one who decided. I set the deed on the table beside me and sat with it a long time. My children could talk about nursing homes and senior apartments all they wanted, but this house was mine. It would stay mine until I said otherwise. That night I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed, listening to the old furnace kick on and off, feeling the weight of that paper settle into me like a stone, but not a heavy one. A grounding one. Over the next few days I began moving differently. Not in ways anyone else could see, but in ways I could feel. I walked through the house with slower, more intentional steps, noticing the details I'd once overlooked. The way sunlight fell across the kitchen counter in the morning, the faint scent of cedar in the closet, the familiar groan of the back door's hinges. It occurred to me that my children saw this house as a burden. They saw the mortgage long paid, the equity it held, the work it required. They didn't see the life inside its walls. But I did. I saw the value in every worn floorboard and faded curtain. And I knew then that I wasn't ready to hand that over to anyone. Least of all those who had quietly pushed me to the margins. I didn't announce my decision. There was no need. But I began to imagine what it would look like to take quiet steps toward protecting what was mine. One evening I sat at the kitchen table with my address book open. I found the number for Ellen, an old friend of Harold's and mine, a woman who'd worked in real estate for decades before retiring. We hadn't spoken in years, but when she answered, her voice was warm as though no time had passed. We spoke of small things at first, her grandchildren, the weather, the garden she still kept, and then I asked her a simple question. Do you still know any good property lawyers? She did. And she promised to send me the name. That night I tucked the deed back into the cedar chest, but it felt different now. It wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was a lifeline. I still saw my children in the weeks that followed. We spoke about everyday matters, the weather, a neighbor's passing, a recipe Claire had tried. They didn't notice the way I no longer sought their approval. They didn't sense that the ground beneath me had shifted. That was fine. I wasn't ready for them to know. In the quiet of my own mind, I began to trade the heaviness of that Thanksgiving for something steadier. I started making lists of what I valued, of what I wanted to keep, of who I could still trust. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I wasn't simply enduring the decisions of others. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was more like a slow, deliberate reclaiming, step by step, thought by thought. Somewhere deep inside, a truth was taking root. They could decide many things without me, but they could not decide this. Not my home. Not my dignity. And I knew even then that protecting one meant protecting the other. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Let me know in the comments. The first step was small. A fresh yellow legal pad from the dollar store. A pen with ink that flowed smoothly. I set them on the kitchen table and wrote, in neat block letters at the top of the page, what I will keep. It wasn't just about things, though some were on the list. Harold's old workbench in the basement, the quilt my mother stitched by hand, the maple tree out front that had shaded every summer of my life here. But as the list grew, I realized it was also about what I would keep of myself. My independence, my say in where I lived, my right to close my own front door at night and know it was mine. I began sorting through the cedar chest. The deed came out first, smoothed flat on the table, followed by the property tax receipts, the old mortgage paperwork stamped paid in full from 20 years ago. I organized them into a manila folder and labeled it in thick black marker. House mine. The next day I walked to the local bank. The air was cold but dry, the sky pale blue above the bare trees. Inside, the teller recognized me and smiled warmly. I asked about renting a safety deposit box. She led me to a small private room and explained the process. Within half an hour, the deed and the folder were locked away in a box no one could open without me standing there, key in hand. Walking home I felt lighter. The papers were safe. Out of sight from curious eyes and idle hands. I called Ellen that afternoon. She gave me the name of a lawyer she trusted, David Grant. A man she'd worked with for years, known for handling property matters with quiet efficiency. I wrote his number carefully in my address book. When I called his office, the receptionist's voice was calm, professional. We set an appointment for the following Wednesday. She asked if I'd need directions, and I told her I knew exactly where the office was. I'd passed it hundreds of times without ever imagining I'd need it. In the days before that meeting, I went through the house with new eyes. The kitchen drawers, I sorted them, throwing away what was broken, keeping what was good. The closets, I made neat piles. Keep, donate, discard. The attic. I opened boxes I hadn't touched in years, pulling out Harold's fishing tackle, my wedding dress, photo albums heavy with memories. It wasn't just tidying. It was claiming. Every object I touched, I decided its fate. Not Michael. Not Claire. Me. On Wednesday morning, I dressed with care. A dark wool coat, my good leather gloves, the scarf Harold bought me the Christmas before he died. I took the bus into town. The law office was on the second floor of an old brick building, its windows tall and slightly wavy from age. David Grant was a man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that stayed on you when you spoke. I told him I wanted to make sure my home could not be sold or signed away without my consent, no matter what happened to me. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he nodded once slowly. He explained that we could set up a living trust, naming me as the sole trustee while I lived. That way, the property would remain in my hands until I chose otherwise. If I became unable to manage it, the successor trustee I named would take over, someone I trusted. Someone who would not treat me like a problem to be solved. The words felt solid in my ears. Not hope, not theory, a plan. We discussed details. I told him about the house's history, about Harold's work on it, about how it was the place where both my children took their first steps. He didn't rush me. He seemed to understand that this wasn't just paperwork. It was the binding of something far older than ink. By the time I left, the first draft of the trust was in motion. I stepped back out into the cold air with a folder in my bag, and a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I didn't tell Michael or Claire. They didn't need to know, not yet. My power now rested in the quiet work of protecting what was mine without announcing it. In the evenings I kept going. I updated my will. I made a list of accounts and passwords, stored them in a sealed envelope in the safety deposit box. I even opened a small savings account in my name only, putting in what I could spare from my pension each month. All the while, when my children visited, I played the part they expected, polite, agreeable, willing to listen. But inside, the current was running stronger. Every paper signed, every drawer sorted, every step toward securing the house added to a foundation they couldn't see. And I began to notice something else. The more I acted quietly in my own interest, the less their disapproval touched me. Their sidelong glances, their suggestions about easier living, rolled off me like rain. I didn't need to argue anymore. I knew what I was doing, and that was enough. There's a certain peace in silent preparation. No fanfare, no confrontation. Just the steady work of building a wall around what matters. And with each passing day, I felt the bricks rising higher, one careful layer at a time. I knew deep down that the day would come when they'd see what I'd done. But for now, this was mine to know, mine to shape. And in that quiet knowledge, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt safe. Strange how the mind works. One moment, you're folding laundry in the here and now, and the next, some quiet sound or stray scent pulls you back decades. That week, it was the smell of starch from a freshly pressed tablecloth that did it. The crisp scent filled the kitchen, and before I knew it, I was 19 years old again, standing in my mother's front room, watching strangers carry her life out the door. My mother had been a proud woman, though her pride was never sharp. She'd lived through the Depression, raised 3 children, and lost my father when she was still young. Everything she kept in her little house had been cared for, polished, mended, treasured. She never had much, but what she had was hers. When her health began to fail, she tried to keep it quiet. We noticed small things: dishes left in the sink, a dress unbuttoned wrong. My older brother said it was just age. My sister called it slipping. I called it exhaustion. We all had our own words for it, but none of us could agree on what to do. Then one day, without telling me, my brother and sister arranged for her to move into a nursing home. They said it was for her safety. I found out when I arrived at her house to bring her groceries and saw a moving truck parked out front. The door was open. 2 men I'd never seen were carrying her rocking chair down the steps, the one she'd rocked each of us in as babies. My mother was sitting in the kitchen, her coat buttoned wrong, her eyes distant. She didn't look at me when I came in. I asked what was happening. My sister said it was already decided. My brother said the doctor had agreed. They'd signed the papers that morning. I remember looking at my mother's hands, small lined, resting in her lap, and realizing she wasn't holding anything. Not her keys, not a bag, not a single thing from the home she'd kept for 40 years. Everything was being taken from her in the name of help. She lived in that nursing home for almost 4 years before she passed. The staff were kind enough, the halls were clean, but she never smiled the way she had in her own kitchen. She never baked bread again, never tended her lilacs in the spring. It was as if the walls had closed in around her spirit, shrinking it until only the quiet was left. I carried guilt for a long time after she was gone. I told myself I should have fought harder, should have refused to let them move her. But back then I was young and outnumbered. My voice didn't carry the weight it does now. I think that's why in these past months I felt the pull of that memory so sharply. Because what I'm facing now isn't so different. The language is the same: safety, convenience, what's best. The tone is the same too. Decisions made without my presence, justified by care that feels more like control. The truth is, my mother never wanted to leave her home. She told me so one afternoon, sitting on the small bed in her nursing home room. The sunlight fell across her face and she said softly, "I would have been all right, you know, if they'd just let me stay." That moment etched itself into me. I promised myself then that I would never let anyone take me from my home without my say. Not for convenience. Not for ease. Not even for safety, if it meant stripping away the life I had built inside these walls. It's not that I'm blind to my age. I know the stairs are harder now, the winters longer, the nights quieter. I know the risks, but I also know the cost of giving up your place in the world before you're ready. And it's a cost no one else has the right to pay on your behalf. When I came back to the present, folding that tablecloth in my kitchen, I felt the memory of my mother's eyes like a weight in my chest. She'd been erased quietly, politely, the way I am being erased now. And I realized with sudden certainty that this wasn't just about me or even about Harold's house. It was about keeping the promise I'd made decades ago, in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and loss. I would not leave like she did. I would not be moved without my hand on the door. So I smoothed the tablecloth, placed it neatly in the drawer, and felt something in me settle. The reckoning I'd begun in small steps was no longer just practical. It was personal. Generational. If my children thought I would simply fade from my own home the way my mother faded from hers, they didn't know me as well as they thought. It was a Thursday afternoon in late January, the kind where the sky hangs heavy and gray, and the light fades early. I had been in the back bedroom, sorting through old boxes, when the sound of voices carried in from the kitchen. I froze, my hand still resting on a stack of Harold's sweaters. Michael's voice was low but clear. He was on the phone. I knew that tone, careful, practiced, the way he spoke in business meetings. "Yes," he said. "The property's in good shape. Built in the late 60s, solid foundation, newer roof. We could get a fair price even without renovations." There was a pause and then he added, "It's my mother's, but yes, we're working on that. We'd want it on the market by spring." The sweaters slipped from my hands. My heart thudded in my ears. I stepped closer to the doorway, careful not to make the floorboards creak. "I understand the legal side," Michael continued. "I've already spoken to my sister. She agrees it's the right move. We just need to be smart about timing so it doesn't cause tension." There was another pause and then I heard him laugh softly. "Oh, she'll be fine. She's not using half the space anyway. And the money will go toward her care." Her care. As though I were a project to be managed, a cost to be allocated. I couldn't hear the other person's words, but Michael's next reply made the blood drain from my face. "All right then. Let's set up a time for you to walk through. We'll say it's a routine inspection, nothing official yet. That way she won't ask too many questions." I stepped back from the doorway, the sweaters still in a heap at my feet. My knees felt weak, and I reached for the edge of the dresser to steady myself. The air in the room seemed thinner, harder to draw in. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't guesswork. They were making plans to sell my home, the house Harold and I had built, the place where every corner held a piece of our life, without telling me until it was already too late. I thought of my mother again, sitting on the edge of that narrow nursing home bed, her hands folded in her lap, stripped of every piece of her life that had been hers. The same quiet removal was coming for me, only this time, it wore the faces of my own children. When Michael hung up, I stayed in the bedroom until I heard the front door close behind him. I stood in the silence for a long while, staring at the sweaters on the floor. My fingers itched to fold them, to bring order to something, but I couldn't move. Later, when I walked into the kitchen, the smell of his aftershave still lingered in the air. On the counter sat the small notepad I used to jot down grocery lists. His handwriting was there in blue ink. "Call realtor back Tuesday 3 p.m. The neatness of the letters made my stomach twist. I slid the notepad into the drawer and shut it firmly. Then I walked through the house, one room at a time. The living room, where Harold and I had sat on the couch on winter nights, reading in companionable silence. The dining room, where every Thanksgiving used to be loud and full. The kitchen, worn but steady, where I'd cooked countless meals for the very people who now planned to take it from me. It was in the hallway, looking at the framed photographs of birthdays and Christmas mornings, that I felt the weight of it all settle on me. This was not about concern. It was about control, about taking before I could say no. And it was being done with a kind of politeness that made it all the more ruthless. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of the furnace. The house seemed to breathe with me, each sound familiar and comforting. I thought about how easily those sounds could be replaced by the sterile quiet of a place chosen for me by someone else. And in that sleepless stretch I felt something harden in me. I had already begun my quiet preparations, but now the work had a new edge. This was no longer about caution. This was about protection. They thought they could sell the house because I was quiet, because I had not yet said no. But they had mistaken my silence for permission. I knew with a certainty as solid as the foundation under my feet, that this home would not be theirs to give away. Not now. Not ever. After that day, I stopped trying to be heard. It wasn't surrender. Not in the way they might have hoped. It was a choice. I no longer offered explanations for my decisions. No longer filled silences with reassurance or gratitude. I let the space stretch between us wide and quiet, until it felt like its own kind of wall. When Michael called the following week to check in, I answered politely, but I gave no updates. He asked how I was, and I told him I was fine. He asked what I'd been doing, and I said, "Oh, this and that." My words were plain, my tone even. I could tell it unsettled him. I withdrew from the family group messages. The cheerful photos of their outings, the jokes sent back and forth, I stopped responding. After a few weeks, they stopped sending them to me altogether. I let that absence settle in without protest. When they visited, I no longer hurried to make coffee or set out cookies. I didn't offer them a seat at the kitchen table unless they asked. The house remained warm and neat, but my attention was no longer theirs for the taking. I started locking my bedroom door at night. I told no one. It wasn't that I feared them in the physical sense, but I'd learned that a locked door sends a message even without words. You don't have access here. I moved the manila folder labeled House Mine from the cedar chest to the safety deposit box, along with my will and the new trust paperwork David Grant had prepared. The key to that box now hung on a simple chain I wore beneath my clothes. And still, on the surface, life looked unchanged. I attended church on Sundays. I walked to the post office twice a week. I waved to neighbors from the porch. I kept my routine steady. But I no longer invited my children into the spaces where my real decisions lived. There was a strange freedom in it, this deliberate quiet. I had always thought standing up for yourself meant speaking out, making your position known. But I was learning there is another way, to move in silence, to let your actions take root unseen, until the day they bloom in full view. Michael and Claire didn't notice the small changes at first. But over time I saw it in their faces. A flicker of confusion when I didn't offer them the information they were seeking. Pause when I didn't leap to explain. One afternoon, Claire stopped by unannounced, her arms full of grocery bags. She said she'd picked up a few things for me just in case. I took them with a polite thank you and set them on the counter. I didn't unpack them while she was there. She lingered, clearly waiting for me to gush with appreciation, but I didn't. I simply asked if she needed to use the bathroom before her drive home. I watched her smile tighten. She was used to me filling the space with warmth. Now I gave her space, but it was cool, unadorned space. I began to notice how much of our past interactions had depended on my eagerness to be included, to prove I was still part of their lives. Without that eagerness, the balance shifted. They didn't know quite how to approach me. I also stopped giving them opportunities to assess my home. If they asked to stop by with something, I suggested we meet in town instead. When Michael mentioned bringing over a friend who could help with a few repairs, I told him I'd already taken care of them. It wasn't a lie. I'd hired a handyman from the church bulletin to fix the loose railing on the back porch. Paid in cash. No paper trail they could see. In the evenings, I found myself spending more time in the garden, even in the cold. I'd walk the perimeter of the yard, checking the fence, the shed, the maple tree that still stood firm despite the years. I thought of Harold often during those walks, how he believed in tending to what was yours quietly without boasting. That's what I was doing now, just in a different way. The quiet shift was working. I could feel it. Their certainty that I would go along with whatever they planned was loosening. They didn't press me as hard about downsizing anymore. They were still circling, I could sense it, but they no longer walked so boldly through the door. I knew they might see my silence as distance, maybe even coldness. And perhaps they were right. But I also knew something they didn't. Coldness can be a kind of preservation. Ice keeps things whole when warmth would cause them to break apart. One evening, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I realized that I hadn't felt that frantic, hollow need to be included in weeks. The quiet was no longer just a shield. It had become my companion. It allowed me to think clearly, to act deliberately, to move at my own pace. They could make all the plans they wanted in whispered conversations and phone calls I wasn't meant to hear. I no longer cared to interrupt them, because when the time came, my answer would not be given in words. It would already be written in the deeds and papers tucked safely away in the bank vault, in the trust documents signed and sealed, in the keys I kept around my neck. And they wouldn't see it coming. Not because I wanted to surprise them, but because they had never believed I was capable of moving in silence. That would be their mistake. It was early March when the letter arrived. A plain white envelope, my name and address written in careful script. No return address. The postmark was from the next town over. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thick, cream-colored, folded in thirds. The handwriting was familiar before I even finished opening it. Ellen. She wrote to say she'd been thinking of me since our last conversation. She reminded me of the summers we used to spend canning peaches together in her kitchen. The way Harold would always wander in to taste test and end up eating half the jar. She said she admired the way I'd handled everything lately, the quiet steadiness in my voice when we'd spoken. And then at the bottom, she'd written something that made me stop and read it twice. They can't take from you what you hold too tightly to let go. The law can help, but so can the heart that refuses to open its hands. I folded the letter back up and set it beside my tea. I don't know why those words hit me so hard. Maybe because for weeks I'd been so focused on protecting the house through paperwork and preparation that I'd forgotten the other part. The part inside me that had to stay unshaken. I decided then that I wouldn't just hold on to my home. I'd hold on to myself. The next day, I called David Grant's office to confirm the final trust documents were ready. When I went in to sign them, he looked me in the eye and said, "You're doing the right thing." I believed him. David also suggested I keep a written record. A small private log of anything my children said or did regarding the house. Not because you're expecting a fight, he said, but because having the facts on paper will give you peace of mind. So I bought a small leather-bound notebook from the stationery shop. I kept it in the drawer of my nightstand, and each night I jot down anything worth remembering. Dates of visits, words said, the tone they carried. Not every page was filled with tension. Some were blank and some had simple entries like March 8th, quiet day, birds returning to the yard. But it felt good to keep my own account, my own truth in my own hand. In April, Ellen invited me over for tea. It had been years since I'd sat in her kitchen. We drank from the same rose-patterned cup she'd had since the 1970s, and she asked me to tell her everything. I did. I told her about the overheard phone call with the realtor, the paper plate at Thanksgiving, the tightening circle my children had drawn around me. She didn't interrupt, only nodded slowly now and then, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she reached across the table and patted my hand. "You're doing what your mother couldn't," she said softly. "You're holding the line." That night I thought about what she'd said. My mother had faced her own quiet erasure, and I'd carried that guilt for years. But now I could see it differently. This was my chance to turn that old wound into something stronger. I began to notice subtle changes in myself. My posture straightened when I walked into the bank or the post office. I didn't rush my words anymore when speaking to people in authority. I felt grounded, the way Harold used to when he stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets, surveying the work he'd done. The ally I'd found in Ellen was more than just a friend. She was a mirror, reflecting back to me the strength I didn't always see in myself. And the trust I'd built with David, the lawyer, gave me a quiet confidence I hadn't had before. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was steering. I started making small improvements to the house, not for resale value, but for my own comfort. A new coat of paint on the front door. A stronger lock on the back. I had the gutters cleaned and the maple tree trimmed. Each change was like pressing my fingerprints deeper into the place. A quiet message to myself that I was still shaping this home. By late spring, I noticed the way my children hesitated when they spoke about the house. They'd mention it less, or frame it as a distant thought rather than an immediate plan. I didn't know whether they suspected my preparations, or if my silence had simply unsettled them enough to slow down. Either way, I kept my course. Sometimes in the evenings I'd sit with Ellen's letter in my lap, running my fingers over the loops and curves of her handwriting. The law can help, but so can the heart that refuses to open its hands. I understood now what she meant. The documents and locks and bank keys were one kind of protection, but the truest defense was this unyielding will I felt growing inside me. A will that said, "I am not ready to let go. And I will not." That was my ally too, not just Ellen, not just David, but the part of myself I'd rediscovered. The part that had survived Harold's passing, my mother's decline, and years of slow, polite erasure. The part that still knew how to stand, even when no one was looking. And I knew, as the lilacs began to bloom by the porch, that whatever came next, I would meet it with that same steadiness. Have you ever found strength in moments of silence? Let me know. It started subtly, the way the first signs of spring appear, small, almost unnoticeable, until one day you realize the landscape has changed. Michael came by one Tuesday afternoon unannounced, the way he used to when he wanted to check on something around the house. But this time he lingered in the doorway instead of stepping in. I could see his eyes flick toward the locks on the door, new solid brass, before he smiled and asked how I'd been. We talked about the weather, the neighbor's new puppy, the late frost that had nipped the daffodils. But he didn't bring up the house. Not once. And when he left, I noticed he hadn't walked through the rooms like he sometimes did, taking in the layout as though committing it to memory. Claire's change came a week later. She called one evening to tell me she'd been thinking about things, and that maybe we should slow down on making any big decisions about my living arrangements. I didn't ask what had brought on this shift. I simply said, "That's probably wise," and let the silence rest between us until she filled it with talk of her garden. The realtor never came back. I knew because I'd quietly asked Ellen, who still had friends in the business, to let me know if anyone was showing interest in my property. There had been one initial inquiry weeks ago, but nothing since. It wasn't guilt, not exactly, that I saw in my children, it was hesitation. Something had unsettled their certainty. Maybe it was the fact that I no longer volunteered information. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in my voice when I did speak. Or maybe it was the invisible line I'd drawn that they couldn't quite name but could feel. By early summer, the visits grew less frequent. At first, I wondered if this was another kind of exclusion, another step in the slow removal they'd begun last year. But it didn't feel the same. This wasn't avoidance, it was retreat. They still called now and then, but the conversation stayed on safe ground. Weather, recipes, birthdays. The questions about the house, about my health, about next steps. They were gone. One afternoon, while I was deadheading the petunias by the porch, I saw Michael drive by slowly. He didn't stop. He didn't wave. He just looked toward the house, his expression unreadable. I watched the car disappear down the street and realized he was no longer sure what was his to approach. The absence of their pressure left more space in my days. I filled it with small projects. I organized the pantry, repaired the loose lattice under the porch, and even painted the kitchen walls a pale yellow Harold would have liked. Each task made the house feel more like mine again, not just in name but in presence. One Sunday at church, Mrs. Hanley mentioned she hadn't seen my children around much lately. I smiled and said, "They're busy." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. I didn't feel the need to explain. Still, there were moments when I sensed the undercurrent of their earlier intentions. A letter arrived in the mail from an elder care facility in Cedar Falls. Glossy brochure, smiling faces, bold print promising comfort, community care. No return address from my children, but I didn't need one to know. I slipped it into the drawer with my notebook and wrote down the date it had arrived. Later that week, Claire called, her voice carefully casual. She asked how I was feeling these days, whether I'd been managing all right. I told her I'd been walking more, sleeping better, and eating well. All true. I didn't mention the new security light I'd installed over the back door, or the fact that David Grant had finalized every piece of paperwork that secured this house in my name alone until the end of my life. That was the quiet beauty of it. They didn't need to know. The work was already done. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if they'd ever admit what they'd planned. Probably not. Their version of events would likely always be wrapped in the language of concern. But that no longer mattered to me. What mattered was that their plans had stalled. Not because I'd confronted them, but because I'd built something they couldn't see, and it had made the ground beneath them uncertain. I think about Harold often during this time. He used to say that a well-built house could withstand more than anyone guessed, as long as its foundation was strong. My foundation now was more than wood and brick. It was the knowledge that I had done what needed doing without asking permission. By late August, I noticed something else, the guilt. It was there, quiet but visible, in the way Michael's voice softened when he spoke to me, in the way Claire lingered on the phone longer than necessary. They didn't say the words, but I could hear them all the same. The consequence of their betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the slow realization that I was no longer in their hands, and that they had no say in when or how I might be. And that, in losing that control, they had also lost something else: my openness, my easy trust. I still loved them. That hadn't changed. But the terms had. It was early October when the air began to change, carrying that first sharp edge of autumn. The maple tree in the yard had just started to turn, a few crimson leaves drifting to the ground. I'd been waiting for the right moment. Not to lash out, not to accuse, but to speak the truth plainly in my own time, in my own way. The moment came on a Sunday afternoon. Michael and Claire had both stopped by, something that hadn't happened in months. They arrived separately but within minutes of each other, as if some unspoken agreement had been made. We sat in the living room, the afternoon light spilling across the carpet. The conversation was polite at first: the weather, the price of groceries, the school schedules of their children. I let them talk, sipping my tea, letting the small talk settle in. Then I set my cup down, folded my hands in my lap, and said very evenly, "I need to make something clear to both of you." They looked at me, their faces open but wary. "This house," I said, my voice steady, "will stay mine for as long as I live. It will not be sold. It will not be transferred. It will not be promised to anyone. When I am gone, it will pass according to the arrangements I have already made. But until then, it is not up for discussion." Michael shifted in his seat, his mouth opening as if to speak. I held up my hand, not sharply but firmly. "Let me finish. I know there have been conversations, decisions made without me. I know there have been plans. You may call them concern. You may even believe that's what they were. But the truth is, you were deciding something that was never yours to decide. I have lived in this house for nearly 50 years. I have kept it standing, kept it warm, kept it filled with the life your father and I built. And I will decide when, or if, I ever leave it." The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Claire's eyes darted to Michael, but he kept his gaze on me. "We were only thinking about." I shook my head gently. "I know what you were thinking about. And I am telling you plainly that it will not happen. I have taken the necessary steps to make sure of it. That's all I need to say on the matter." They both sat back, their expressions unreadable. I didn't fill the space with more words. I didn't justify or explain or soften what I'd said. I had spoken the truth, and it was enough. After a long pause, Claire nodded slowly. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said quietly, "All right." We moved on to other topics after that, but something had shifted in the air. The conversation was lighter, less guarded. Perhaps because the unspoken tension had finally been given its name and its boundary. When they left, I walked them both to the door. The sun was dipping low, painting the maple leaves gold. Claire hugged me a little longer than usual. Michael glanced back at the house as he stepped off the porch, his face softer than I'd seen it in months. I closed the door, locked it, and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the quiet. The confrontation hadn't been loud. There had been no anger, no accusations. But it had been final. And in its quiet way, it had been powerful. The truth is, I didn't speak those words to win a battle. I spoke them to draw a line that could be crossed only if I allowed it. And I knew, standing there in the stillness of my home, that I never would. It's a strange kind of peace, the one that comes after you've said what needed saying. Not the giddy relief of victory, but the deep steadiness of knowing you've claimed your ground. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen, the way I used to when Harold and I would sit together after the dishes were done. I set Ellen's letter beside it, reread her words, and felt their truth in my bones. They can't take from you what you hold too tightly to let go. And I was holding on. The weeks after that conversation felt different, lighter somehow, though nothing outward had changed. The house still stood in its familiar quiet, the maple tree still let go of its leaves one by one, and the days still moved at the steady pace they always had. But inside me the air had cleared. I no longer woke in the night replaying overheard words or imagined scenarios. I didn't brace myself for the next subtle push toward leaving. The line had been drawn, and even if my children didn't entirely like it, they understood it. I began to pour my attention back into the life I wanted, not the one I'd been defending. The kitchen was the first place to feel it, the smell of bread baking again after too long, the cheerful clutter of flour jars and measuring spoons. I started keeping a vase of fresh flowers on the table, even if they were just the last stubborn marigolds from the garden. I took to walking to the library twice a week, checking out more books than I could possibly finish just because I could. On sunny afternoons, I'd sit on the porch with a novel in my lap, watching the neighborhood carry on. Children racing bikes down the street, a young couple planting tulip bulbs across the way, the postman making his steady rounds. The garden became my favorite place again. I cleared out the weeds that had crept in during my months of distraction. I planted winter pansies by the front steps and tucked garlic cloves into the soil for the spring. The work was slow but satisfying. Each task was a small reminder. This place was mine to tend, mine to keep. By late November, I'd even begun hosting again, though in my own way. A neighbor, recently divorced, started coming by on Thursdays for supper. We'd sit at the kitchen table over a simple meal, soup, bread, a slice of pie, and talk about everything from the weather to the books we were reading. I realized how much I'd missed the easy company of someone who didn't see me as a responsibility to manage. In December, I rented the upstairs room to a young teacher from the high school. She needed a place close to work. I wanted the extra income and the presence of another person in the house. She was quiet, respectful, and eager to shovel the snow before I even thought to ask. The arrangement suited us both. My children noticed the changes, though they didn't comment on them directly. Michael would call and ask how the tenant was doing, his voice tinged with curiosity. Claire would remark on the garden during her visits, her tone softer than it had been in a long time. I could see they were recalibrating, realizing that I was not only holding on but thriving. I didn't take any of it for granted. I knew how close I'd come to losing not just the house, but the sense of myself that lived inside it. And I knew that without the quiet groundwork, the paperwork, the planning, the steady resolve, I might still be in a state of waiting, wondering when the next push would come. Instead, I woke each morning to the light falling across the same bedroom walls Harold and I had painted together decades ago. I brewed coffee in the same kitchen where we'd shared countless breakfasts. I walked the same floors, sat on the same porch, tended the same garden, but it all felt renewed because I had chosen it, claimed it, and kept it. Sometimes, in the evenings, I would sit in the living room with only the lamp lit, listening to the old clock tick on the mantel. I'd look around at the walls lined with photographs, at the small signs of life that had returned to every corner, and I'd feel that quiet swell of gratitude that comes when you know you are exactly where you are meant to be. Life wasn't perfect, it never is, but it was mine again. And that was enough. Some evenings, when the light is low and the air smells faintly of wood smoke, I find myself standing at the kitchen window, looking out over the yard. The maple tree stands bare now, its roots deep in the earth, unmoved by the winds that pass through. I think about how much I have in common with that tree, planted long ago, weathered through seasons, still holding my place. This house isn't just wood and nails. It's the echo of Harold's laugh in the hallway, the creak of the stair where my children once sat to open Christmas stockings, the worn patch on the porch where I've stood 1,000 mornings with my coffee. It's every choice I've made to stay, to keep what matters, not because it's easy, but because it's mine. I've learned that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you keep for yourself, especially when others think they know what's best for you. I've learned that silence, when chosen, can be stronger than any argument. And I've learned that the quiet act of holding your ground can be the loudest thing you ever do. I don't know how long I'll be here. None of us knows how much time we have. But I do know that when my time comes, it will be from this place on my terms. And until then, I will fill these rooms with life. Bread baking, flowers blooming, friends laughing at the kitchen table. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, if someone has tried to decide your life without asking you, I want you to hear this. Your worth does not depend on their understanding. You do not have to open your hands just because someone is reaching to take what's yours. Hold on to what matters. Hold on to yourself. If you've ever felt forgotten or unseen, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments.